In a peaceful town, with only 3 days to save her honor and her life, a black woman is falsely accused of drug trafficking. But can she uncover the truth before everything unravels? You won't believe the shocking outcome as the terrible secrets begin to unfold. Arcadia Hills, a small town quietly nestled among lush green hills, is known for its quiet streets, tree-lined avenues, and cozy homes that seem straight out of a painting. Mornings are gently kissed by mist, which slowly gives way to the warm, golden sunlight that bathes the ancient houses, creating a peaceful scene that feels like a perfect portrait of home. However, beneath this calm exterior, Arcadia Hills hides a quiet tension that few ever notice. Lila Thompson, a fierce and passionate community activist, stands before the community center holding flyers, inviting everyone to attend a meeting on police reform. She is not a politician or a fame seeker, just an ordinary woman, a citizen of this town who wants to change the injustices she sees unfolding. The poster on the wall advertises her meeting, titled Police Reform, a step forward for the community. Despite being well-loved in the community, Lila can feel the cold, unfriendly gazes following her from a distance, the whispered gossip in the shadows, the silent head shakes from those who avoid her presence. None of it escapes her notice. Lila's no stranger to these suspicious glances, but today something feels different. She climbs the stone steps, her eyes scanning the familiar faces of people walking by, but none of them stop to talk. The air feels heavier, and the people seem to move farther away from her than ever before, as if an invisible wall has been erected between her and the world around her. Lila looks up at the sign for the community center, then surveys her surroundings once more. A chill runs down her spine as though someone is watching her every step. It's not the ordinary fear she's used to. It's something deeper, something more dangerous. Perhaps her efforts are stirring things that others would rather remain untouched. But Lila cannot stop. She has been silent for too long, enduring injustice for far too long. Today, she decides to stand up, no matter the cost. Lila Thompson, daughter of a former NSA official, grew up surrounded by stories of justice and truth, values her father, Walter Thompson, instilled in her. Every evening, her father, a visionary and talented cryptographer, taught her that justice was never easy but always worth pursuing. So, when Lila witnessed the increasing acts of racial discrimination in her community, she couldn't stay silent. She began to fight for fairness, not only to protect her own rights, but to change a system that had been rotten for years. She advocated for police reform, calling for transparency and fairness in how the community, especially the black community, was treated. However, Lila's passion and vision were not welcomed in Arcadia Hills. When she organized meetings about police reform, she started to notice undeniable signs of resistance. Local officials whom she had once trusted began to withdraw, no longer participating in the important conversations about change. The town's police officers, instead of supporting her, found ways to avoid and dismiss her demands. Lila felt herself becoming increasingly isolated, not just from the authorities, but from the very community she had once served. The suspicious glances, the unspoken questions in every encounter, made her feel the growing distance between herself and those around her. In the evenings, Lila spent her time researching and planning for the meetings, but she couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion as she thought about the constant disappointment. She questioned if she was doing the right thing. Did anyone really care about the change she was trying to bring? Despite her determination and persistence, the loneliness slowly consumed her, making her initial efforts seem insignificant in the face of the ongoing opposition from entrenched powers. The sense of hopelessness from her closest friends didn't help either. Though she knew justice had to be fought for, she couldn't help but feel weighed down, as if every step she took was trapped under the shadow of constant resistance and pressure. Those late nights were no longer just about hard work. They were moments of psychological struggle as she questioned whether she had the strength to fight until the end, or if it was all just a futile attempt. The Arcadia Hills police, once seen as the steadfast pillars of the town, now began to regard Lila with unfriendly eyes. Captain Raymond Walker, a muscular and authoritative man, had always been respected for maintaining order and security in the town for many years. However, to Lila, he embodied conservatism and stood as a barrier to any change that might threaten his power. Lieutenant Samuel Clark, Walker's colleague, always stood behind him, closely monitoring every step Lila took, as if every one of her actions was a direct threat to the system they had worked so hard to uphold. Lila's meetings, which appeared to be simple discussions about reform and injustice, were actually a significant challenge to the stability they sought to maintain. Lila could feel the shift in the atmosphere every time she entered important meetings. More and more police officers began to show up at her gatherings, not to participate or offer assistance, but to observe and control her every move. Their gazes, once filled with trust, had turned cold and scrutinizing, as though they were searching for any mistake that could disrupt the movement Lila was leading. She realized that she was slowly becoming the target not only of criticism from officials, but also from those she once considered allies. Every step, every decision she made was now under surveillance as they looked for any weakness they could exploit to attack her. The tension grew day by day. Lila started to realize that the police cars parked near her house were not mere coincidences. Every time she went outside, it felt like someone was watching her. A black car had appeared several times as she walked through quiet streets, only to disappear whenever she stopped. Lila couldn't help but feel like she was being hunted. The more she tried to remain silent, the greater the pressure became. She knew that not only was her fight at stake, but her safety and that of her family were now under threat. The feeling of being watched wasn't just an unease. It was a clear warning of what was to come, a conspiracy slowly revealing itself. Every step she took, every word she spoke could be the final blow that those in power were waiting for to bring her down. The tension mounted like an approaching storm, and Lila realized that she was no longer just fighting injustice. She was up against dark forces trying to strip away everything she had fought for and built. On a blistering summer afternoon, Lila Thompson stepped out of the Field and Family grocery store, the familiar sound of the store door closing behind her as she balanced several bags of groceries in her arms. The moment felt like any other ordinary day, one of the rare breaks she had in between her relentless fight for justice and community reform. She was looking forward to preparing dinner for her family, the mundane task a rare escape from the pressure she'd been under. As the sun beat down on her, she let out a sigh of relief, pleased with her small accomplishment. But that sense of peace was shattered in an instant. Without warning, two police cars screeched into the parking lot, tires screeching as they came to an abrupt stop. Lila paused mid-step, the bags of groceries heavy in her hands, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. From behind the tinted windows of the vehicles, the figures of two officers emerged, their movements deliberate and unhurried, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. Lieutenant Samuel Clark, a tall, imposing figure with a cold, calculating demeanor, was the first to approach. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unblinking. Lila felt the weight of his gaze like a physical blow. Behind him, Officer Jeff Perkins stood back, his arms crossed, his presence just as intimidating. He didn't need to say a word. His stance alone spoke volumes. A crowd of curious shoppers had begun to gather, their gazes flicking from the officers to Lila, a silent tension building in the air. Lila's heart began to race. She felt her throat tighten as she realized that all eyes were on her, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just her and the two officers standing in front of her. Lila Thompson. Clark's voice sliced through the heat of the afternoon, cold and deliberate, echoing across the otherwise still parking lot. His words hit her like a punch in the gut. "We have a warrant for your arrest for drug trafficking." Lila's world tilted on its axis. She couldn't comprehend what she had just heard. The bags of groceries slipped from her grip, falling to the pavement with a heavy thud as she took a stunned step backward. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind refused to process the words. "Drug trafficking? This is a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong. This is—" She stopped herself, the words dying in her throat. There was no denying the look in Clark's eyes. It was as if he had already convicted her, and no protest, no explanation could change that. Panic began to claw at her insides. She had spent years fighting for justice, for transparency, for the rights of her community, and now she was being accused of being a criminal. The irony, the absurdity of it all, twisted her stomach. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Was this some sick joke? A ploy to stop her, to discredit her? Lila's eyes darted frantically around, but there was no one to help her. The shoppers who had been glancing at her were now all looking away, as if they too were waiting for the inevitable. A few stood frozen, whispering in hushed voices, but no one stepped forward. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, she felt the overwhelming weight of isolation. Clark didn't wait for her to gather her thoughts. He stepped closer, his presence looming over her like a dark cloud. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a clear plastic bag filled with a white powder. Evidence, he claimed. This was found in your vehicle, he said, his voice emotionless, as if the truth had already been written. We found drugs in your car. This is drug trafficking, Lila. Lila's heart dropped into her stomach as she stared at the bag. Her legs felt weak, and her breath became shallow. This couldn't be real. She didn't know what that was, how it had ended up in her car. No, this is not mine, she shouted, her voice rising in panic, but her words faltered, hollow and weak. She wanted to scream, to deny it with everything she had, but it felt as though the words were slipping through her fingers. The people around her stood silent, observing her like a spectacle. Some stared with shock, others with judgment, but none of them offered any help. Lila felt the weight of their stares, each one like a heavy chain binding her to a reality she couldn't escape. She was alone. The reality of the accusation settled like a heavy fog in her chest. Everything she had worked for, all her ideals, everything she had believed in, was now being used as ammunition against her. Officer Perkins moved in then, his hands cold and firm as they wrapped around her wrists, forcing her hands behind her back. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he said, his voice unyielding. Lila could barely respond, her mind reeling with confusion and terror as she felt the handcuffs click shut around her wrists. She was dragged toward the police car, her legs barely able to keep up as the weight of her own body seemed to collapse under the strain. The once ordinary afternoon was now a blur of lights, sounds, and the deafening beat of her own racing heart. Lila tried to speak, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Every breath she took seemed weighed more heavily than the last, as if the air itself was trying to smother her. This was happening. It was real. She was being arrested, not just for a crime she hadn't committed, but for everything she had worked for. Her fight for justice, her efforts to make the town better, everything she stood for was now under attack. Don't fight this, Perkins said again, his grip tightening on her arm. You don't want to make things worse. Lila couldn't believe what was happening. She had never broken the law. She had never been anything but a voice for the voiceless, a fighter for what was right. And yet, here she was, handcuffed and being treated like a criminal. The weight of it all was suffocating. The terror she felt, the crushing sense of betrayal from those she had trusted, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As she was shoved into the back of the police car, her mind raced. She had to find a way out of this. She had to prove her innocence. But as the door slammed shut behind her, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The conspiracy, the forces at play, were much larger than she had ever imagined. And as the car began to pull away, Lila knew she was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting for her life. Lila was dragged into the police station, the cold, hard concrete walls pressing in on her, sinking deep into every fiber of her being. She couldn't fathom what was happening. The harsh glow of the neon lights stung her eyes, and the heavy air seemed to suffocate her. The officers surrounding her were silent, watching her every move as she was led into a small interrogation room. She was forced to sit on a metal chair, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The rigid, painful position only heightened the tension coursing through her body. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Lila in the sterile, oppressive silence of the room. It was just her now, alone with the chaos in her mind and a multitude of questions that had no answers. The officers entered, their faces unreadable, as if they had already decided her guilt. Captain Raymond Walker, the leader, stepped forward, his eyes sharp as a blade, and began speaking in a voice that sent chills down her spine. Lila Thompson, we have enough evidence to prove you're involved in drug trafficking. You'll pay for your actions. Lila's throat was dry, her voice barely escaping as she struggled to speak. I didn't do anything, she cried out, her words trembling but filled with determination. This is a misunderstanding. I have nothing to do with drugs. She tried to steady herself, But the weight of hopelessness crept in, turning her voice weaker with every word, as though they could see through her every claim of innocence. Lieutenant Samuel Clark and Officer Jeff Perkins stood behind her, unmoving, indifferent. They had listened, but it was clear they weren't willing to believe her. Walker sat down at the table and opened a thick file, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness, as though every word in her defense was useless. "We've gathered enough evidence," Walker said, staring her down. "Witnesses, physical evidence, and testimonies from reliable sources. All of it points to your involvement." Lila shook her head. Her mind raced to recall every detail from that day. It had happened so fast. She had stopped to shop, and then suddenly she was arrested. But there was no clear evidence, no solid reason to accuse her. All she had was the truth inside her. But in this room, it seemed meaningless. Another officer entered, holding the plastic bag Clark had retrieved from Lila's car. "We've thoroughly examined it, Lila. This is irrefutable evidence," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "What do you have to say now?" Lila stared at the bag, the world tilting beneath her. She had never seen it before. The feeling of despair washed over her like a crushing wave, as if she were being buried under an avalanche. Every argument, every piece of evidence she had was worthless here. Everything was stacked against her. False testimony, fabricated evidence, a trap she couldn't escape from. "This isn't mine," Lila shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence of the interrogation room. No one answered her. No one listened. All she felt was the cold, indifferent presence of the officers, who seemed determined to push her further into this dark corner. She felt as if she were being pushed into a situation with no way out. Her words, her claims of innocence, were like whispers in the air, vanishing without a trace in the heavy atmosphere. She had no strength left to fight, no hope for escape. All that remained was an overwhelming sense of despair as she realized that every door had been closed, and she was trapped in a battle she could no longer control. Since her arrest, Lila had been forced to endure not only the challenges of the interrogation room, but also the escalating loneliness and fear that gripped her every day. In the days that followed, she felt as though everyone in Arcadia Hills was watching her with suspicious eyes, even though they knew she was a good person. Old friends, once her allies in the fight for reform, now turned their backs, avoiding her at every turn. Lila couldn't understand how empathy and friendship could shift so quickly. She felt abandoned, left to face a system that seemed intent on pushing her into the shadows. Rather than remaining silent or working with the truth, the Arcadia Hills police decided to escalate their smear campaign. They began fabricating stories about Lila, blaming her for incidents that they themselves had orchestrated. Things worsened when local media outlets started to spread these falsehoods, slowly eroding Lila's reputation in the eyes of the public. Articles claimed she may have been involved with criminal organizations, and even more damaging rumors circulated alleging that she had received money from opposing groups to sabotage the police. Lila couldn't understand it. The people who knew her best were now believing these lies, and no one had the courage to stand up and defend her. Lila soon realized that those pulling the strings weren't just the police officers, but the powerful figures in the town, individuals who held sway over everything around her. They weren't just protecting their image. They were determined to extinguish any efforts at change that she was fighting for. The manipulation from these forces left Lila feeling as though every ounce of hope she had was being stripped away. She couldn't find the words to explain herself, couldn't clear her name as the government and those in power systematically worked against her. Every move she made, every action she took, felt as if it was being scrutinized and judged, further clouding her vision for the future. In the days that followed, she received no support from her neighbors or old friends. Some people in the community even began to avoid her, as if simply being near her would make them the next target in this battle. Lila no longer had the strength to argue against the criticism and doubt that followed her every step. She could only sit in the emptiness of her room, feeling the weight of her solitude. She didn't know where her future was heading, whether she would ever find justice and clear her name, or if she would remain trapped in an unjust case forever. The loneliness and pressure she felt seemed to drag her deeper into an abyss where every move she made could lead to total collapse. One late evening, as Lila sat alone in the dimly lit room, her heart heavy with anxiety and despair, she received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was firm but carried an underlying warmth, causing her to pause and listen carefully to every word. "Lila, this is Jason Miller. I'm a friend of your father." Lila was stunned, unable to believe that someone she had only heard of through her father's stories was suddenly reaching out to her at this critical moment. Jason Miller, a former NSA official who had worked closely with her father for many years, had heard about her case and decided to take action. His voice remained as steady as it had been in the days when he worked with her father, but this time there was something more behind it, a promise, a commitment. "I know you're going through a lot right now, but I can help. I've already started investigating your case, and I will uncover the truth." Lila was taken aback. It felt like a small spark of hope had ignited in her heart, but just as quickly, fear and doubt began to overshadow it. While Jason's promise brought a sense of relief, she couldn't shake the worry about what would happen next. The Arcadia Hills police were not easily defeated, and everything about this case had been meticulously orchestrated. Though her father had once been a powerful figure, she couldn't help but wonder if Jason had enough influence to stand up to the powerful system working against her. She was incredibly grateful for the support of someone so close to her family, but deep down, the skepticism still lingered. Would there be enough evidence to turn the case around? Could they find something strong enough to counter the police's manipulation? Lila couldn't stop thinking about the difficulties Jason would face in this investigation, and whether someone on the outside could truly help her overcome a system that had deliberately ruined her life. Yet, despite her fear, there was something inside her that began to rise, a hunger for hope. Jason was someone her father had trusted deeply, and if he had decided to get involved, then at least it was a start. This was her chance to keep fighting, even if the road ahead remained unclear and fraught with obstacles. A week after Jason's call, Lila received a message from him asking her to meet him at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Her heart raced as she stepped into the cafe, where Jason was waiting. His posture, with his steady, determined gaze, conveyed the seriousness of the work he was doing. "Lila," Jason said as soon as she sat down, "we've uncovered some major mistakes in your case." Lila felt a rush of anticipation flood through her. "Mistakes?" she asked, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Does this mean they've been wrong from the start?" Jason nodded. "There are discrepancies in the evidence the police presented. We've gone through all the documents and information related to your arrest, and we found several contradictions." He continued, "The evidence they used to charge you isn't strong, and there are clear signs that it's been tampered with." Lila stared into Jason's eyes, unable to hide her astonishment. She began to believe that what he was saying might actually be true, but a part of her still feared that this was just a faint hope. "So what did they do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason pulled out a thick folder, flipping through a few pages before pointing to several sections. "Lila, in the police report, there's one very important detail they overlooked. The drug test reports are logged with incorrect times, and the witness statements don't match up. Additionally, we found a video from the security camera at the grocery store where you were arrested, but this video was deliberately edited." Jason paused, letting Lila take in the information. "I had this video sent to a digital analyst, and he managed to recover the deleted portions." A surge of hope slowly grew within Lila as she heard this. She started to feel that she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Jason and his team were genuinely digging into things she couldn't have done herself, and they were uncovering critical facts to prove her innocence. A part of her began to truly believe that just maybe, this case could be overturned. "So what do we do now?" Lila asked, her voice filled with hope, though still tinged with worry. Jason smiled, a reassuring and confident smile. "We'll keep digging. It'll take time to gather more evidence, but I believe we'll find the truth." He placed his hand on the table and looked at Lila with unwavering determination. "You have the right to clear your name, Lila, and I'll help you get that justice." Lila felt a sliver of light piercing through the darkness. She no longer felt entirely abandoned. There were still people out there fighting for justice, and Jason was one of them. She could be exonerated. She could get her life back. This hope felt like a fresh breeze, dispelling the darkness she had lived in for so long. Although Jason and the investigative team had brought a new spark of hope, the threat from the police showed no signs of easing. With each passing day, Lila felt the pressure and danger she faced more acutely. The suspicious glances from the town's people seemed sharper, and the whispers behind her back grew louder. The police, especially Captain Raymond Walker and Lieutenant Samuel Clark, showed no signs of retreating. They weren't just trying to protect their image. They were determined to crush every effort Lila made, regardless of whether she was right or not. They were willing to do whatever it took to prevent the truth from coming to light. Lila felt cornered, not just by the people behind the conspiracy, but also by the very community she had once loved. The meetings with her supporters became fewer and fewer, and those who had stood by her now turned indifferent, afraid of the consequences if they dared to speak out. It felt like every attack was now aimed squarely at her, leaving her without protection. The unexplained phone calls, the police cars parked near her house every night, it all seemed like clear threats. One morning, as Lila drove to Jason's office, she noticed a car with an unmarked license plate parked right in front of her house. During the drive, she could sense other drivers watching her through their rearview mirrors. When she stopped at a red light, the car behind her did too, almost as if it were following her. A suffocating sense of dread washed over her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Was it one of the police officers tailing her, or just a coincidence? But as she glanced into the rearview mirror, she saw a figure in the car staring directly at her. By the time she reached Jason's office, her heart was pounding, not from any work-related anxiety, but from the fear that grew stronger by the hour. She sat at her desk, staring at the pile of documents, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. Everything around her spun in circles, and she couldn't stop asking herself, did she have the strength to keep fighting this battle? Everyone around her remained silent. No one was helping her. No one was stepping up to defend her. Jason had done everything he could, but even he couldn't help her face the powerful police force that stood in her way. She couldn't stop thinking about the escalating threats. Would anyone step forward to protect her when things got worse? Lila felt the crushing weight of loneliness, as though she were lost in a battle with no way out. The hope she once had now seemed fragile as she realized that no matter how hard she fought, the people in power would always find a way to crush her efforts. Despair took hold of her mind, and for the first time, Lila wondered if she could ever truly win this fight. After weeks of tension, Lila began to feel a faint glimmer of light at the end of the dark tunnel. Jason and her legal team worked tirelessly, going over every piece of evidence and checking every detail in the case file. Each time they uncovered a new detail, each time they discovered evidence that had been manipulated, a bit more hope kindled in Lila's heart. The small clues, when pieced together, seemed to form a clearer picture of the injustice she had been enduring. Along with her team, Lila began investigating potential witnesses, people who could help her. While Jason and the legal experts worked on the complex legal documents, journalists like Tanya Love, who had helped her bring the story to the public, also began investigating the signs of wrongdoing in Lila's arrest. Tanya was not just an investigative reporter. She was a friend who stood by Lila's side, helping her uncover the connections between police officials and those manipulating the situation. Each time Lila received new information from her team, her heart raced, but soon after, anxiety would wash over her. Evidence was starting to surface, but the tension remained palpable. Although they had uncovered discrepancies in the police reports, falsified evidence in the data collection process, and conflicting testimonies from witnesses, Lila knew there was still much work to be done. Any change, if it was to come, would not be easy. She and her team would face strong resistance from the police and powerful officials. They wouldn't let her win so easily. Lila also began to feel the threat more clearly, as the police and those protecting them seemed to grow increasingly anxious about what was unfolding. It was obvious now that not just she, but her entire team was being targeted. Anonymous phone calls, threatening messages from unknown sources began to appear, and Lila could feel the mounting tension in the air. Despite this, she couldn't stop. Every discovery, every piece of evidence uncovered only fueled her determination further. Hope, though fragile, continued to grow in her heart. She was no longer alone. Everything, from the smallest details to the larger truths, was slowly being revealed. But each step came with its own risks. The anxiety remained, and she knew greater obstacles awaited. However, Lila also realized that she had come farther than she ever thought possible. Things were beginning to change. It was no longer a solitary fight. As evidence began to emerge and the truth about the police's misconduct slowly came to light, Lila couldn't help but feel that everything was slipping further beyond her control. The threats she faced were no longer just whispers or subtle insinuations. They had become direct and more dangerous than ever before. One evening, after a long day working with her investigative team, Lila returned home to find a broken window. Her heart sank as worry and tension flooded her mind, but she initially chalked it up to an accident. However, when she stepped inside, her worst fears were realized. The living room was ransacked. Objects were scattered across the floor, and on the coffee table, a torn piece of paper lay with a chilling message. "If you don't stop, you'll have nothing left." Lila couldn't process what was happening. She quickly called Jason, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. The threat was now more real than ever. It wasn't just the police cars parked near her house at night. Now her family was becoming the target. Her mother, Carolyn, had begun noticing the shift in how the neighbors treated them. Some turned their backs, no longer offering even a simple greeting, while others looked at her with wary, doubtful eyes. Lila began to feel that in her fight for justice, she was putting her loved ones in danger. The following day, as she left home to meet with the investigation team, Lila noticed a black car parked on the street. It kept its distance but was clearly watching her. This wasn't the first time it had happened, but today the feeling of fear was stronger than ever. She decided to turn back home to check if she was being followed. As she neared her house, the black car continued to follow, but when she turned into the alley that led to her home, it didn't follow. Yet the headlights still blazed in her rearview mirror, making her feel as though she was being threatened with every step. That evening, when she got back home, she didn't dare turn off the lights. The fear consumed her, but it wasn't just about physical safety anymore. Lila realized that the psychological toll of these threats was beginning to break her down. Every time she saw a police car near her neighborhood, her heart weighed heavily. She couldn't help but feel as though every move she made was being watched, and every decision could bring her closer to disaster. The more she thought about it, the more Lila realized that these threats weren't just physical, they were seeping into her mind. She couldn't relax, couldn't sleep peacefully at night without the constant worry that something terrible could happen. She started feeling as though she couldn't even go outside after dark. Her mental anxiety gradually took over, and Lila felt as though she was trapped in a fight she could no longer control, not just physically, but mentally as well. Lila faced a harsh truth. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the threat that loomed over her. And the tension didn't just come from the outside, it was beginning to stem from within herself. Every step she took, every decision she made now felt like a heavy burden that couldn't be shaken off. The subtle threats from the police and the system she was fighting against were pushing her into a corner where she couldn't see a clear path forward and didn't know if she could continue the fight. Although Lila still felt the looming threat from the police, in recent days she began to notice a significant shift in the community of Arcadia Hills. The loneliness and fear that had consumed her for so long were gradually replaced by a glimmer of hope. The townspeople who had once avoided her were now beginning to stand up and openly show their support. This change, especially after the evidence of police misconduct began to unfold, broke the silence that had long plagued the community. It all started when a group of teachers and small civil organizations in town, who had once been threatened or ostracized for their reform ideas, began speaking out publicly. Meetings, workshops on policy reform, and public forums started to draw the attention of more and more people. Lila received countless messages and calls from supporters, not only expressing their sympathy, but also offering to join her fight. One call that Lila would never forget came from Mrs. Rose, an elderly woman who lived near her and whom she never thought would take action. "Lila, I know what you're going through, but we, the people here, won't let you stand alone. Let us help you." The support grew stronger when a massive rally was organized in town square. Signs and slogans demanding justice and transparency in police actions began to appear everywhere. The townspeople, young and old, families and individuals, came together to participate, even though they knew they would face oppression. The crowd, with their chants, not only demanded justice for Lila, but also called for a change in how the police treated the community, especially the Black community. Lila stood in the crowd, her eyes brimming with tears as she saw all those who had stood up for her, those who had once been silent but were now ready to fight for justice. She couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, she was no longer fighting alone. People around her, from friends and teachers in the town to strangers, were all united with a common goal: to reclaim justice. Slogans like "Justice for Lila" and "Transparency for the Police" echoed through the air, filling the atmosphere with a powerful energy. Hope flared up within Lila's heart. She felt a new belief rising within her. The community she once thought had turned its back on her had now become her allies in this fight. She was no longer alone in the struggle for justice. She realized that no matter what happened, they couldn't be defeated when they stood together. Despite the dangers still lurking and the threats from the police remaining, Lila knew that the people around her would not abandon her. Hope burned brightly in Lila's heart like an unquenchable fire. She felt stronger, not because of herself, but because of the people who had stood up for justice. The banners and slogans were not just calls for change. They were reminders to Lila that she was no longer fighting alone. She had an entire community, an entire town standing behind her, ready to do whatever it took to reclaim justice. Though many challenges still lay ahead, this feeling gave Lila the strength and determination to continue. The day Lila had long awaited had finally arrived. The trial was beginning. Everything before that moment had been steps taken in the dark: tense investigations, veiled threats, and fragile hopes. But today, all of that had to face the light of truth. Lila sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding, her hands cold and clammy. She couldn't believe that after everything she had endured, she was finally standing here, under the harsh lights, in front of the court and the public. Every eye was on her, and she could feel the intense atmosphere in the room. Lila's legal team had been working tirelessly for weeks, preparing for this legal battle. Jason, her father's old friend, stood beside the legal team, constantly reviewing important documents. He still held firm in his belief in justice, but Lila could sense the worry in his every movement. They all knew this was their last chance to prove her innocence. Although all the evidence had been meticulously prepared and the testimonies from her supporters were ready, Lila couldn't help but feel the weight of tension in every passing second. The trial began with the prosecution's opening statement, painting a dark picture of Lila and her alleged involvement in drug trafficking. Fabricated evidence was presented, and the tension immediately enveloped the entire courtroom. Lila tried to stay calm, but she could feel every pair of eyes in the room fixed on her, each word from the prosecutor like a sharp knife piercing her heart. She couldn't stop asking herself whether she could prove her innocence in the face of everything stacked against her. When it was time for Lila's legal team to present their evidence, the atmosphere in the room shifted. One by one, the evidence and testimonies from her supporters were presented. Those who had stood by her, teachers, social activists, and townspeople, were there to testify. The heartfelt testimonies began to reveal the manipulation by the police, the discrepancies in the reports, and the falsified evidence. Lila felt a surge of strength as she listened to the passionate words from those who had stood by her through this entire journey. Still, she couldn't ignore the tension in her chest as she saw the judges and the public watching closely. She knew that no matter how strong the evidence was, the final decision rested in the hands of those in power. Time seemed to freeze when Lila stood up to give her testimony. She could feel the heavy silence in the room, but this time she was no longer afraid. She took a deep breath, her gaze resolute, and her voice filled with determination. "I did not commit any crime. I have never done anything wrong. I am simply fighting for justice, and I will not allow these forces to destroy me or what I believe in." Her words echoed in the space, but she knew that only the truth could save her now. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Lila was facing the final opportunity to reveal the truth. Everything seemed within reach, but she couldn't shake the anxiety, knowing that her innocence could only be acknowledged if the evidence and testimonies were strong enough to break down the prosecution's arguments. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. One more step, and it could all come crashing down. But if she made it through this challenge, the truth would be revealed, and justice would prevail. In the midst of the trial, as the testimonies of witnesses and evidence were being presented, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment. Lila sat there, her hands tightly clenched, each second feeling like an unrelenting battle. Despite the tireless work of her legal team facing the tricks and manipulation of the prosecution, the anxiety within Lila couldn't be fully shaken. Everything depended on her testimony and the preparation of her legal team. But just as all hope seemed to be nearing the edge of despair, an unexpected event occurred. The courtroom doors suddenly swung open, and a man in military uniform stepped in, carrying an aura of authority and power. Every eye in the room turned to him. It was General Jason Miller, the former NSA official whom Lila had heard so many stories about from her father. With his confident and stern demeanor, he walked to the podium and announced that he had crucial evidence that would change everything. A strong wave of hope surged in Lila as she heard the name Jason Miller. He was someone she fully trusted, someone who had worked alongside her father for many years, and now he was the one who would help her find justice. General Miller began to open a thick folder and placed it on the table. Digital files, videos, and detailed reports were projected onto the large screen in the courtroom. Everyone in the room focused intently on each image that appeared. The first video shown was from the security camera of the grocery store where Lila had been arrested. The room fell silent, eyes fixed on the screen as Lila's car appeared. The video then showed Officer Perkins opening the door of Lila's car and placing a plastic bag containing white powder inside. Time seemed to slow as the footage became irrefutable evidence of the police planting false evidence in her car. Hope flooded Lila's heart. Everything she had endured, the threats, the isolation, could be proven wrong. Her eyes welled up with tears, her heart pounding, but she fought to maintain her composure. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The evidence General Miller brought was the clearest proof of police manipulation. This not only exposed the lies but also showed that Lila had been unfairly attacked. Lila watched as several judges and magistrates in the room visibly changed their expressions. The video forced everyone to reconsider the case. The truth could no longer be hidden. She noticed the reporters in the room frantically jotting down every word from General Miller, and she knew that this story would soon be broadcast widely. Everything she had endured, all the false accusations, would now be recognized as part of a conspiracy, a deceitful plot. Though the tension remained, Lila couldn't deny that she had made a significant breakthrough. Hope burned brightly in her heart as the truth was finally revealed. The fears and anxieties that had consumed her seemed to fade away, replaced by a strong belief that justice would be served. She no longer fought this battle alone, and now she had one thought in mind. The truth would prevail. As Lila stood in the courtroom, the air seemed to contract, and time felt like it had stopped. The final words had been spoken, and now everything depended on the judge's decision. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, each second stretching on endlessly as all eyes in the room were focused on the judge who would deliver the final verdict. Judge Robert Mayfield, who had listened to all the evidence, testimonies, and arguments from both sides, stood up. His gaze was stern, yet there was a trace of empathy in his eyes. The courtroom fell silent, everyone knowing that this was the decisive moment. Lila held her breath, staring at the judge, unable to predict what would happen next. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies presented during the trial, the court has reached a decision. Judge Mayfield began, his voice reverberating through the room. The charges against defendant Lila Thompson, including drug trafficking and obstruction of justice, are without sufficient legal grounds or evidence to proceed. Therefore, the court declares Lila Thompson not guilty and dismisses all charges. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence before a wave of emotion erupted. Lila stood there frozen, her hands trembling as they clenched together, unable to contain the flood of emotions. The suffocating pressure of the past months, the sleepless nights, and the fears of retribution were finally replaced with a joy that words could not capture. Tears began to fall down her face, not from pain, but from relief and the recognition she had waited so long for. Lila could hardly believe that she had finally been exonerated. Her mother, Carolyn, stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face. She rushed over and embraced Lila tightly, as if trying to wash away all the years of suffering Lila had endured. The people in the courtroom began to applaud, not just to congratulate Lila, but because justice had been restored. Those who had stood by her through the difficult journey could not contain their joy. Jason, the close friend of her father, stood beside her, smiling with pride, his eyes filled with emotion. "This is a victory for all of us," Lila whispered to her mother. But both of them knew that this was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for justice, for the belief in a system that could rise up against the abuse of power. As Lila stepped out of the courtroom, the sunlight bathed her face as if every shadow in her life had been dispelled. She no longer had to live in fear, no longer had to worry about threats. Instead, there was a new hope within her. She had won, and justice had been restored, not just for herself, but for the community she had fought for and protected for so many years. The overwhelming feeling inside Lila wasn't just relief. It was a renewed belief in a brighter future, one where justice and truth could always prevail, no matter how powerful the forces trying to suppress them. After the historic trial, with the truth finally exposed, those involved in the conspiracy against Lila began to face the consequences of their wrongful actions. The police officers who had fabricated evidence and abused their power to destroy her life, Captain Raymond Walker and Lieutenant Samuel Clark, could not escape the investigation. Investigators from the Department of Justice, led by Jason Miller, dug deep into their serious misconduct. From manipulating evidence to coercing witnesses into silence, each of their actions was meticulously documented and brought to light. The prosecution didn't take long to build a strong case against these officers. Lila felt a sense of relief when she heard the news that Walker and Clark were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. After further investigation, these officers were charged with abuse of power, evidence fabrication, and attempting to ruin Lila's reputation. The court ruled on the serious charges they had committed, and eventually, they faced harsh sentences, including imprisonment. Each verdict brought a significant step toward restoring justice. Lila couldn't contain her emotions when she heard this news. She knew that although it had taken time for the truth to be recognized, those responsible had finally been held accountable. Joy and satisfaction flooded her heart. Justice had been served, not only for her, but for all those who had been oppressed and treated unjustly. After the shocks the town of Arcadia Hills had endured, everything slowly began to change. The people in the community, those who had previously remained silent, now began to speak out. Those who had once felt afraid and abandoned now stood tall and demanded change. Even the city government, despite initial resistance, could not stay out of the movement. The town began implementing strong reforms in the police system. Oversight and accountability of police behavior were placed at the forefront. A citizen oversight committee was established to monitor and ensure that all police actions were transparent and fair. Continuous training on racial discrimination and equitable treatment was held, and the processes for handling citizen complaints were significantly improved. Lila watched this transformation with pride and hope. She knew that these reforms couldn't undo the suffering she had endured, but they would create a new justice system where no one would have to endure the abuse of power again. The sense of hope grew within her as she saw the community rising up to protect justice, and the town began to change in a powerful way. Looking back on the arduous battle she had fought, Lila felt not only proud of herself, but also of the community she had fought for and with. She realized that this fight wasn't just for her, but for all those who had been oppressed and treated unjustly. She wasn't just fighting to clear her name. She was fighting to change the system and create a fairer future for everyone. Lila continued her work, not only as a fighter for justice, but also as a strong leader in the community. She continued working with community groups, organizing discussions on policy reform, and educating citizens about their rights. From someone who had been wronged, Lila had become a symbol of hope and strength. She understood that even though this battle had ended with a significant victory, her work was only just beginning. The changes she had started in the community would continue to be nurtured and developed, and in her heart, hope swelled, knowing that this fight had not only brought personal fulfillment, but also opened a new chapter for her community, a community that had learned to stand up and refuse to accept injustice. Lila smiled as she saw the members of her community continuing to participate in reform activities. She knew that although many challenges lay ahead, they now had the strength to truly make a change. And for her, the satisfaction came from seeing the change already beginning, not just in her life, but in the hearts of all those who had fought for justice. That day, Lila stood before the crowd at a large rally, her eyes following the people who were clapping and chanting slogans calling for justice and change. Lila had become a symbol of the political reform movement, not only in Arcadia Hills, but in many other communities where injustice and racial discrimination still prevailed. She felt pride swell in her heart as she witnessed the changes she had helped bring about. Lila's life had completely transformed. From someone who was once doubted and falsely accused by society, she had risen to become a leader, a relentless fighter for justice, not only for herself, but for those who had been oppressed. Though she had endured painful months, she no longer felt tired or afraid. Instead, she was filled with hope and determination because she knew that her actions weren't just for her own benefit, but for others as well. Even though she had overcome the trials, Lila remained steadfast in her values and beliefs about justice. She understood that every significant change begins with small, persistent steps, and Lila had done just that. The satisfaction she felt wasn't from personal victory, but from witnessing the transformation of her community. Hope for the future, for a more just society, had become the driving force for her to continue moving forward. Lila continued her journey, fighting not only for those who were oppressed, but also to preserve the legacy of her father. Her father, Walter Thompson, who had worked for the NSA and dedicated his life to justice, was a never-ending source of inspiration for Lila. She always remembered his words, "Never give up on the truth, no matter how hard it may seem." Her father's story wasn't just about the memories of a great man, but also a reminder to Lila that she wasn't alone in this fight. His legacy lived on in her heart, helping her stay strong in times of difficulty. As Lila looked back, she realized that everything good she had done was a continuation of the values her father had passed down to her. Every decision, every step she took was connected to the memories of him and the lessons he had taught her. She didn't just want to protect justice. She wanted to ensure that her father's legacy would be passed down to future generations. In every speech, in every battle, Lila would mention her father's name as a thank you, a deep tribute to the one who had guided her down the right path. She knew her father's legacy would live on, not just in her story, but in the changes she had helped create. In the days that followed, Lila and her community continued their fight. The change they had achieved was a significant turning point, but she understood that the work wasn't over. The town of Arcadia Hills had become not just a place to live, but a symbol of unity and determination. Each day, more people stood up, more voices called for justice and transparency. Lila was no longer alone in her fight. The people of the town, those who had once hesitated to stand by her, were now her allies. She saw the transformation in every step the community took, from hopeful meetings to powerful protests demanding justice, from the establishment of citizen oversight committees to the organization of racial discrimination training. The community had come together to work towards a better future. But more importantly, Lila understood that this change wasn't just about new policies or laws. It was about how each person in the community had realized that they could make a difference. Justice wasn't something only a few people in power could enforce. It was the right of every citizen, and only when they united would true justice be restored. The enduring hope within the community had become the driving force to continue building a more just society, one where everyone could speak up and fight for their rights. Lila's story was proof that no one was too small to create change, and with perseverance and determination, anyone could make the world a better place. Lila stood on the stage, looking out at the passionate and determined crowd. She knew her journey wasn't over, but now she was no longer alone. She believed in the power of community, in the potential for change in every individual, and in a future filled with justice and hope. As we come to the end of this incredible journey, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining me along the way. Your support, your comments, and your belief in the power of truth and justice have meant the world to me. This story is not just about one person, but about all of us who fight for what's right, who stand up for those who are voiceless, and who believe that change is possible, no matter how big the challenge. If you've been inspired by Lila's journey, the courage, and the triumphs over adversity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. There's so much more to uncover, and together we can continue to make a difference. Thank you again for being a part of this journey. Stay tuned because the best is yet to come. Let's keep fighting for justice, for truth, and for a brighter future. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.